Well, if there's one thing I can say for certain, it's that there's no way I'm gonna forget about this movie. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about a little known film that you may or may not have heard of, called Spider-Man No Way Home. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's jump right into it and let's talk about Spider-Man No Way Home. This once again stars Tom Holland as Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man. With his identity now revealed, Peter asks Doctor Strange, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, for help. When a spell goes wrong, dangerous foes from other worlds start to appear, forcing Peter to discover what it truly means to be Spider-Man. So considering I've spoken about all the other Spider-Man movies in spoiler detail already, and by the time this is out, it'll have been a little bit since the movie's been released, I am going to divide this up into two sections. We'll first discuss the spoiler-free part of the film, where I give my general thoughts, and then we'll dive right into all the spoilers. I'll timestamp this video so once we get to the spoilers, you can skip ahead to my final thoughts, and then hopefully you come back to the rest of the video. But let's jump right into it. Once again directed by John Watts, the third MCU Spider-Man film picks up right where the last film left off, with Mysterio revealing Spider-Man's identity and framing him as a murderer. And from there, Peter and his family and friends immediately deal with all the turmoil that comes with it. He goes back to his apartment, and helicopters are surrounding the area, and everyone's quickly brought in for questioning. And I will say right off the bat, for those who managed to avoid the seemingly countless leaks that were out about this film actually managed to do a good job of hiding a lot of what was going on. Because when I say this film moves quickly, I mean this moves quick, with a lot of what we saw in the trailer only taking up the first 20 minutes or so, maybe not even 30 minutes of the movie. At least, Peter getting to Doctor Strange is maybe just under a half hour. Now, I've already heard a lot of people refer to this section of the film as being a bit rushed, as if it was just trying to get to the multiverse stuff and not really think through anything that came before it, but honestly, the fast-paced nature of it wasn't anything I had much of an issue with. Because keep in mind, this picks up immediately right where Far From Home left off, and Peter's identity gets revealed in a very public way due to the fallout from a high-profile disaster. Now, while this doesn't exactly allow the film to act that much as a standalone movie, and you will be lost if you know nothing else about the previous movies going in, due to the circumstances, it makes a whole lot of sense as to why this moves the way it does. And this part of the film does a good job of maintaining this consistent tone that we saw in both Homecoming and Far From Home, which had this light, high school teen romantic comedy feel to it, that moves at an incredibly quick pace, which is something that's been said countless times as a criticism about this iteration of Peter Parker in general, where it feels like he's too much in the shadow of the Avengers, and much of what he does has little to no major consequences. But what I will say is, while at first it does seem like this will just be a simple continuation of that, this pulls the rug right out from under us as the film goes on. As we get deeper into this multiverse storyline, this goes from being just another lighthearted entry in the series to something much darker, more complex, and emotional. And we'll get into why specifically in the spoiler section. But to be clear, I was always fine with the direction they initially took with this character. I loved Homecoming, and I find Far From Home, despite some noticeable problems, to be very entertaining, and they acted as a nice change of pace not just for the MCU as a whole, but for Spider-Man himself. I get that it's frustrating how the character felt too much in Tony Stark's shadow for so many movies between his solo films and his team-up appearances, but you also have to keep in mind, this version was introduced a mere 2 years after the Amazing Spider-Man series was cancelled, a series which, by the way, had its first film 10 years after the first Tobey Maguire film and tackled some similar material. There was only a 5-year gap between Spider-Man 3 and the first Amazing Spider-Man, so the turnaround between all these reboots has gotten quicker and quicker. Like I said in my Homecoming review, they had to take the character in a different direction for at least a few movies, because otherwise it would just be labeled as derivative, and I'm glad they did what they did with this character, especially because it gives some extra meaning to this film. As Tom Holland and others have indicated, this is Peter Parker at his most emotionally distressed. Here, he suffers and goes through some extreme things that he's never had to deal with before, and he spends this movie grappling with the decisions he has to make and the consequences of his actions. So he's built up over these last few movies only to get truly knocked down here. A lot of people have jokingly referred to this version of Peter as Spider-Boy or Iron Man Jr. Well, Trust me when I say this is the movie where he goes from being Spider-Boy to Spider-Man. And Tom Holland is phenomenal here. Like, I've always found him funny in his other Spider-Man appearances, and I find him very charismatic in general, even if his non-Spider-Man roles have been considerably hit and miss. But this is easily, without a doubt, one of his best performances, if not his absolute best. It's certainly his finest outing as Spider-Man for the way it explores such a totally different side to him. Now, I mean, we do get some of those quippy one-liners we're used to with him, especially when he's around Doctor Strange and the villains, and more on all of them in a second, but it's considerably more toned down in comparison to Homecoming and Far From Home. Now, he doesn't make this very jarring, sudden shift in personality. He doesn't suddenly act completely different or out of character. It progresses him to this emotional state of mind, and for the most part, it flows well. So much that by the end of this movie, you almost forget he felt like such a completely different person in the way he carried himself from where things kicked off. And one thing worth mentioning regarding Doctor Strange is that he's not in this quite as much as the movie advertises. I mean, he's in it a decent amount, but this isn't exactly a team-up movie where Doctor Strange and Spider-Man battle against the villains together. Their relationship isn't like Peter's and Tony Stark's, or even Peter's and fake Nick Fury from Far From Home. And I don't consider this a spoiler, as you do see bits of this in the trailer, but their relationship becomes more strained as things go on, especially as we do get to see a bit more of Strange's arrogant and sarcastic side. And while we do see Doctor Strange enough that I'd say he's still a major supporting character, and Benedict Cumberbatch is as always charming and funny in his own right, his presence doesn't detract from this being a Spider-Man movie first and foremost. Peter mainly teams up once again with MJ and Ned, played again by Zendaya and Jacob Batalon, with the former now Peter's girlfriend, and their dynamic is better than ever here. I love the way they developed into such an in-sync, smooth operating team that supported one another, with Ned and MJ taking an active part in helping out Peter, similar to the way Gwen Stacy took such an active part in working with the Peter from the two Amazing Spider-Man movies. And I just had a big smile on my face through most of their interactions. I found their chemistry to feel so natural, and it feels like they've all grown so much, especially coming a long way from their dynamic in Far From Home. All three were very funny together, and you can tell there was just a genuine bond present, even among the actors themselves, in the way they all play off one another and took care of one another. Like when they're on the roof together towards the beginning of the movie and they talk about having a fresh start at college, it was honestly very sweet. And what's cool about this film is that it manages to accomplish quite a lot here. It's a major event film, and we'll get more into that in a moment, but it also works exceptionally well as a great character drama. Yes, there are a lot of cool action set pieces and memorable fights, but there's also a real heart and soul present over the course of it. Rarely does it feel like it loses sight of that, and it goes back to what I've been saying countless times over the course of my other Spider-Man reviews. While we do find ourselves sympathizing and rooting for the other Marvel protagonists, what makes Spider-Man in particular so endearing is that his problems feel relatable, even when the context of fighting these powerful supervillains. And we get that here, more than the other two Tom Holland films, I'd say. For the first time in this particular series, we see the burden Peter inadvertently places on his friends and loved ones for being associated with him. Even though they stick with him and they choose to stay by his side, their lives are made much harder by just knowing him. They're all brought in for questioning when he's framed for Mysterio's death, and meanwhile, Ned and MJ can't get into the schools they want because of him. And we feel that. We sit in the moment with these characters a number of times as they take in these very relatable human problems that we can all easily relate to. And for the first time in this particular series, we feel true substantive consequences for all of them, and it adds so much depth and emotion to these films that makes this considerably more endearing than a lot of other big budget blockbuster spectacles, which is something not always easy to pull off in a big event film like this. And because this film goes a lot more for the character drama, I'd say there aren't quite as many action scenes as I think we normally get in these MCU films. Now, I'm not saying it like there are barely any in here. I don't want to misrepresent it as a very dialogue-heavy film, but I'd say it's very balanced in terms of both its character moments and its action. Even though it's a very fast-paced film and there's a lot going on, there are only about 5 big fights throughout the movie, which didn't even fully occur to me at first, considering how consistently engrossing the film was and how long one or two of these action scenes are. But I will say, when the film goes for it, it goes big just about every time. The one heavily advertised in the trailer, where it's Doc Ock versus Spider-Man on the bridge, was really well done, while the fight with Peter and Doctor Strange on the train that's also advertised was also excellent, giving off a lot of great Inception-style vibes that we were getting from the first Doctor Strange. There are also several shots, both during the fights and when things are calmer, where there are clear callbacks to the style of the older films. In particular, there are several shots that especially replicate the style Sam Raimi utilized in his films, with the slow-motion close-ups and zooms that he did, and those were nice. Because another thing this acts is as a tribute to Spider-Man in general. This finds so many ways to honor not just the character's legacy as one of the most popular superheroes of all time, if not the most popular, but also the many films and media that came before it. It's chock full of throwbacks and Easter eggs that pay tribute to the lore of the character, as well as little moments and stylistic nods to the older films, including some of the memes that emerged, so that was cool. But what was even cooler was the inclusion of the villains themselves. This was arguably the biggest draw for the film, as it brings back 3 villains from the Raimi films, as well as 2 from the Amazing Spider-Man films, and they were great to see. Though I have to admit, if there was one slight skepticism I had for this movie going in, it's that their return might be treated more like a gimmick. Like they show up for an extended cameo, say a few classic lines, get some cheap laughs, and peace out. But no. Now, going back to the laughs, there's definitely a lot of fun to be had, as there will be quite a few extended conversations between the Raimi villains interacting with both the web villains and the MCU characters, and they're all trying to understand each other's worlds and compare their experiences, and these will put a big smile on your face, as these can be very funny, as they make cracks about each other's powers and mock one another's abilities. Now, some people might be slightly annoyed that these normally dark characters do take on the usual MCU-isms in some instances, but you also can't have all these characters together and not try to have some bit of fun with it. That's just a wasted opportunity right there if they weren't to do that. So I'm glad they took the directions they took with these characters. But not only are they all a major part of the movie, they all also have developed arcs and have clear motivations for what they're doing, which made me even happier. Now, going back to that argument from earlier that the first half feels a tad rushed, yeah, I'll admit one can argue that there are a small number of beats here and there that feels like they jumped into things, mainly for the way in which a few characters flip from one extreme to the other quickly in a handful of instances just to keep things moving. Like, to give a specific example, the way the Sandman turns on Peter at the beginning was a tad clunky in my opinion, plus I think there were some odd editing choices when it came to them, but for the most part I think the way they're all handled was considerably better than I'd ever expect. It's actually astounding the amount of nuance given to all of them, especially doing so without it feeling overstuffed. I think that was a big concern going in, given that that was the main criticism for both Spider-Man 3 and The Amazing Spider-Man 2. But considering most of these villains appear at the same time and are mostly seen together, and they're working with each other, and we learn everything about them while they're all together, you never got that feel. This isn't like Spider-Man 3, where Peter's individually dealing with the Sandman, then the plot stops so he can deal with Venom, then it has to stop again so he can deal with Harry. They're all in tandem with one another here. So like with a number of other plot elements here, there's a clear balance among everyone and everything. Though the main 3 who are given the most to do are the Green Goblin, Doc Ock, and Electro. Sandman and Lizard definitely have plenty of moments themselves, but the most emotional moments come from the other 3, and they all pick up right where they left off. It's actually amazing how we're seeing these characters, some of which we haven't seen in about 15 years or so, and even in the performances, you can tell they just don't skip a beat. Alfred Molina once again plays nicely into the tragic mad scientist that was a big part of Doc Ock's arc, say that 3 times fast, in Spider-Man 2, and he once again added a lot of heart and soul to the film in his own way. And Willem Dafoe was as menacing as ever as the Goblin, though playing even more into the Jekyll and Hyde aspect of the Green Goblin that was reminiscent of the mirror scene from the first Spider-Man, and I absolutely love that. Like, I was afraid we'd only see the Goblin personality for the majority of the film, but we actually do get both him and Norman, and the way they deal with his struggle between the 2 personalities was surprisingly heartfelt at times. Like, even though he's absolutely frightening as the Goblin, there were times when he's Norman that you feel even worse for this character than you did in the first Spider-Man, and that caught me totally by surprise, as I find that performance to be perfect, so I was very happy about that. And I'm also glad they gave Jamie Foxx something much better to work with this time around. I didn't hate his take on Electro in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but it was clearly a rehash of characters like Uma Thurman in Batman and Robin, and the blue design felt a bit ridiculous. He was clearly trying, and I do find his performance enjoyable, but it definitely wasn't the best they could have done with this character, which is a shame considering he seemed like he really enjoys playing him. So I'm glad they found a way to redesign the character and give him more of a threatening edge while still continuing the arc he had in that movie. They don't just make him completely sadistic and there's nothing to him. This plays nicely into that arc about how he wants to be noticed and wants to be more than a nobody, but here he's also drawn too much to the power that's present in the MCU. It was really cool what they did with him here, and it elevated the character from from just a so-so Spider-Man movie villain to arguably one of the better Spider-Man movie villains. But that's everything I wanted to discuss as far as the spoiler-free section goes. So now I want to talk about the spoilers. So if you haven't seen No Way Home by now and you want to know nothing further, this is your spoiler warning. You can skip to the end of this video where I give my final thoughts, and you can then come back to this after seeing the movie. But anyway, here we go. Going into this movie, there was of course speculation about a number of other people hidden from the trailers who might appear. And when they did appear, it was nice to see that they were more than just cameos and they too actually had a substantial part of the film. But let's talk about first a role that was a cameo that was also speculated upon, but not quite as heavily unless you were on social media pretty regularly, and that's Charlie Cox returning as Matt Murdock in a 1-minute cameo, where he winds up being Peter's lawyer and the one who gets him off murder charges. And I just want to say, I was so happy to see that. Daredevil was one of my favorite superhero shows, if not just one of my favorite shows in general of the last decade, and it was heartbreaking seeing that canceled. So I'm glad that not only have they decided to incorporate the character into the MCU proper, as there's this weird continuity thing where those Netflix shows referenced MCU events, but since Marvel Studios didn't produce them, they're not technically considered MCU productions, but either way, I'm happy to see they're keeping the cast of at least that show, because they all did such a great job in those roles and their time got cut way too short. I'm hoping now that we saw him, we'll eventually get the return of Kristen Ritter, Mike Coulter, and John Bernthal, though that's a story for another day. Now, we didn't get a lot from Charlie Cox here, as he's literally just in one quick scene, but we at least got a nice little tease of his activity as Daredevil, as a brick is thrown into Peter's apartment and he backhand catches it. And he just says when they all look at him shocked that he's just a very good lawyer. I thought that was such a fun moment that teased him as Daredevil and gave us just enough without distracting too much from this being a Spider-Man movie. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with him going forward and where he pops up next. But the two big surprises, or should I say the two worst kept secrets, were of course Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield returning as their respective versions of Peter Parker. Like everyone else, my theater went absolutely nuts when they first walked through their respective portals, and I just had the biggest smile on my face when they appeared. And what made me really happy was, similar to the villains, they're not just there for a quick cameo in the final fight and then they disappear. They take on a major supporting role themselves in the entire third act, and we see them actively trying to console Peter as well as help him in what he initially set out to do with these villains, which is find cures for each of them so they can be spared from death when going back to their respective universes. And once again, it feels like we don't even skip a beat with some of them, even if it has been years since we last saw either of them. And while it was wonderful to see Tobey Maguire again, as he was a Spider-Man of my childhood and he was a lot of fun still being this big goofball so many years later, I gotta say Andrew Garfield was especially in really top form here, and it's clear how much passion he has playing the character. Like I said in my reviews of the two Amazing Spider-Man movies, he really felt like the most underappreciated of all the Spider-Men, as there wasn't as much nostalgia or acclaim for his movies like there was for Tobey Maguire, plus he wasn't the one who got to be a part of the Avengers and play into the larger MCU the way Tom Holland does. He just had these two movies that were sandwiched between much more beloved versions, so he really wasn't given his due as the character, despite my belief that both of his movies are pretty solid despite their faults. But if you were someone who enjoyed them but didn't enjoy his movies, this more than makes up for it, as he provides a lot of great emotional beats in that final act. We find out how he was haunted by the death of Gwen at the end of Amazing Spider-Man 2, and it made him very bitter and jaded, and he goes down a dark emotional path that he doesn't want to see this Peter go down, and you can tell he's still dealing with some emotional issues. And you can clearly see some of that come out in the way in which he interacts with the other Spider-Men, where he's impressed by all their accomplishments as if he looks up to them, and he calls himself lame, and Tobey's Peter has to cheer him up. He puts so much depth into this character that we ever got to explore with him in either Amazing Spider-Man movie, and he really was just fantastic here. Plus, I'm very happy he got his moment of redemption where he gets to save MJ from falling from her death, when he couldn't do it for Gwen. It gave him a nice moment of closure that I just found so heartwarming. It gave him an arc that was paid off 7 years in the making, and I was very happy to see that. And similar to the villains, it was just so much fun seeing all three of the Spider-Men interact and compare their experiences and discuss all the weird differences between them, which is something I never thought I'd ever get to see in a million years. Like, I'm used to when an actor stops playing a big IP character, that's it. When they bring someone else in, there's only that version. I would never think we'd see the day where 3 different versions of Spider-Man, all from movies that were never connected before, all coming together. But here we are, and it was so much fun to get interactions like Tom Holland and Andrew Garfield being in awe of Tobey Maguire's natural web shooters, or hearing Tom Holland brag about the Avengers and the other two have no clue who they are, or Andrew Garfield saying how he wants to fight an alien like the other two. I just could not stop smiling the entire time. Even something so completely throwaway like Garfield cracking Maguire's back, which serves literally no purpose otherwise other than just to make a my back reference from Spider-Man 2, was such a joyous moment. And I'm also just amazed at how much screen time they got, as they even got to spend a lot of time with Ned and MJ during their initial reveal, as well as when everyone's in the lab together trying to come up with the cures. So that was all cool. But to go back to the darker elements of this for a minute, I gotta say, this film's really a lot more clever than I was ever expecting. As I said earlier, this is the film where Spider-Boy goes to truly being Spider-Man, and the way they do it here is actually impressive because they found a new way to give us the Spider-Man origin story without it necessarily feeling that way right off the bat. Because it was always assumed, given Spider-Man's quick introduction in the MCU and the fact he already had the spider bite and was running around in a makeshift costume, that all the events similar to the first Raimi or Webb films already happened. Like, he already went through Uncle Ben dying, but here, it seems like Uncle Ben doesn't exist, because they set up Aunt May to be that Uncle Ben-like figure. Here, she acts as that moral compass for Peter, urging him to cure the villains and trying to keep him on the right track. And here, she's the one who tells him the "with great power comes great responsibility" line. And she winds up dying at the hands of the Green Goblin, though similar to Uncle Ben's death in other versions, it's due to an incident that Peter blames himself for. In this case, Doctor Strange wanted to send the villains back immediately, and it's because Peter defies Strange and attempts to find that cure that allows the Goblin to even get close to May, because he was under Norman's personality at that time. And this winds up being one of the main incidents that really pushes Peter to become the Spider-Man we've always wanted him to be. One who has to deal with the consequences of his actions and grow to be a better person because of it. This is by far the darkest moment for this version of Peter, considerably more than being blipped away with half the universe, and it's made all the more heartbreaking given not only are we initially led to believe May is okay in this moment, but as she lays there dying, she continuously tells Peter in her final moments that he did the right thing for trying to help cure the villains. It's really powerful stuff, and it's in these moments where we see Tom Holland really come through as an actor, as we see him have to grapple with this moment. And it's this, along with that last battle where Peter realizes how badly the spell's gone wrong, with the multiverse beginning to crack, that causes him to willingly choose to have Strange wipe everyone's memories of him. Not just that he's Spider-Man, but that people don't know Peter altogether, including his loved ones. So people will know there's a Spider-Man out there, but not know who his identity is, nor will anyone be aware of who Peter Parker is. Now, while I was curious as to why the spell couldn't have been that everyone could remember Peter himself, but just not that he's Spider-Man, I do also get what they were trying to go for it here. Because this ultimately what brings Peter to the point where a lot of longtime fans have wanted him to be, completely on his own with no help from any other big heroes, or in this case from anyone whatsoever. And even though he says to Ned and MJ that he'll come find them and help them remember who he is, he finds himself unable to do so when he sees how happy they are and how MJ was physically hurt because of her involvement in his Spider-Man adventures. So this sees him making the ultimate sacrifice where he doesn't even want to leave the window of opportunity open for them to get involved again, and he lets them go live their lives. At least for now. And even though he's alone, he's at least comfortable knowing his friends are safe. And that's what Spider-Man is all about. It's understanding what cost it comes to Peter's personal life because he chose to take on this life as Spider-Man, and this found a good way to approach it without doing something similar to Maguire or Garfield's versions where they attempt to make both lives work. Here, he just chooses to have a totally clean slate, cut himself off from everyone, and take on being Spider-Man alone. And while I do hope there's some resolution down the line where he does get Ned and MJ to remember, I am looking forward to seeing where they take this character now that he's free of the Avengers ties and all the Stark tech, and now he has to really make his way on his own as the street-level hero that he's most known for. I know they're starting to look into the next Spider-Man movie, and I'm really excited to see what they choose to do with him. I also know Tom Holland's been going back and forth on how much longer he'll continue as the character, but I do hope he sticks around for a while, as I feel this is only the beginning for him. And to just go back to the villains for a moment before wrapping things up, I think this truly solidifies the Green Goblin as not just the single best MCU villain, even though he didn't start off as an MCU villain, but just one of the all-time best comic book movie villains ever, which I already thought, but just in case you already didn't think that. The way he acts and the effects that he has are, for now, I would argue he's an even worse villain than Thanos, because while Thanos did wipe out half of life for 5 years, that was all undone, and he also did it through what he felt was a logical decision. He thinks in his mind he's doing what he feels is right, despite the fact that he's one 100% wrong. The Goblin, however, is just this pure agent of chaos, and his goals are completely personal, as he looks to ultimately destroy Spider-Man's life. And in essence, he did. While Peter survived the events of this movie and he's going to still be Spider-Man, Aunt May's now dead, his friends don't even know him, he's no longer an Avenger, and he loses all Stark Tech ties, now having to live on his own and just rely on a suit that he stitched together, which does look cool, by the way. And I have a feeling we're going to feel the effects of this long term should Holland continue with this role for an extended period of time. Like I said, I hope some of this eventually does come undone with Ned and MJ, and in the long run, I think it probably will. But given how personal the Goblin's vendetta was and the damage he's caused, now to two different Peter Parkers in such a personal way, this really makes him one of the best comic book movie villains out there, if not the best. But I am happy with how this ended for all the villains, with them getting a true redemptive arc, and they all get sent back to their worlds cured and done with their evil ways. It fits in nicely with the film's themes about second chances, like just how Peter now has a second chance by the end of this film to truly be Spider-Man and not just an Iron Man Jr. Plus, it's an overall second chance for all these characters to go out on a bit of a high note, including our other two Spider-Men. I mean, while both Maguire and Garfield are beloved as their respective Spider-Men, they both ended their series on what was considered low notes by both critics and fans. So it was nice to see them and the villains all return for this, where it's something much more substantive. And while I have a good feeling this isn't the last time we'll see a few of these characters, in particular Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, for those whose last appearance this truly was, this allows them to go out on such a high note. Only minor criticism I had for these returning characters, and it wasn't that big of a deal, was that I do wish Thomas Hayden Church and Reza Fons physically appeared as the Sandman and Lizard's human states. They both do return to voice their characters, and it was great to hear them, as they both have a lot of fun moments. But it was slightly awkward where at the end, they get transformed back to their human form, and it's just this reused Spider-Man 3 and Amazing Spider-Man footage, and they don't say another word for the rest of the movie. It was a little off-putting given how big of a part they played right up until that moment, and everyone else who was transformed back got at least a few lines in now that they're back to normal. Though I'm also aware they were filming this while restrictions from the pandemic were tighter, and they probably were just trying to keep as many people offset as possible, so I get it, but still, it would have been cool to see. Spider-Man No Way Home is a film that truly lived up to the hype. This is a film that manages to go bigger and bolder than either of its predecessors and be this highly entertaining, spectacle-filled blockbuster while still maintaining a lot of humor and heart. While this is packed full of fan service that will have you smiling from ear to ear, and it can be very funny, it's also one of the most emotional Spider-Man movies to date, and honestly, one of the most emotional MCU movies to date. While sometimes you can feel the film was trying to get through a lot, it manages to weave in so many different elements without it feeling overstuffed or too rushed. Not only did it offer us a lot of fantastic performances from returning players like Andrew Garfield, Willem Dafoe, and Alfred Molina, but it also solidifies Tom Holland as truly one of the best Spider-Men, with this being his finest performance as the character to date. This is a love letter to the character, and one that Spider-Man fans will certainly have a lot of fun with. Spider-Man No Way Home gets a 9.5 out of 10. Part of me had that very slight skepticism going in that it wasn't going to live up to the hype, but this was everything I'd ever want from a Spider-Man movie. It's not flawless, and it's another case of the good elements do make up for some of the clunkier elements, which themselves didn't bother me that much, if I had to be honest. But this was still an incredible movie. It's quite possibly my new favorite MCU movie overall, which I find myself almost shocked to say, as someone who's always been a bit skeptical every time I hear how this one's now the best one. But I had a big old grin on my face the entire time, and I know part of it might just be due to my love of the character, as well as seeing some of those older films, so there is a bit of that curve there, but I'd be lying if I say I didn't love it. I just had that good of a time. But anyway, now that I've finished reviewing all the other Spider-Man movies, stay tuned, as up next will be my ranking of all the Spider-Man and Venom movies. And in the meantime, let me know, did you see No Way Home, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Is this now one of your favorite Spider-Man movies? Is it now one of your favorite MCU movies? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.